welcome to Literary Hype. I am Stephanie, your Literary Hype Woman, and today on the Author Conversation series, I get to introduce you to a debut author. Although, if you've been around BookTube, you might already know her, especially if you love Victorian literature. I'm talking about Katie Lumsden. She is known for talking about Victorian literature on her YouTube channel, Books and Things, and now she's got her own book coming out. So let's dive into this conversation with Katie about her book, The Secrets of Hartwood Hall. Welcome to Literary Hype. How does it feel to be a debut author?
Yeah, good, exciting, mostly quite strange and a bit surreal, I would say.
So give us a little introduction to The Secrets of Hartwood Hall.
Sure. So The Secrets of Hartwood Hall is a work of historical fiction. So it's set in the Victorian period in the 1850s. And it's about a woman called Margaret Lennox. She is a governess. She's also a widow. Her husband has recently died. And so she goes back to work as a governess, which is what she did before her marriage. She takes up the first position she can find because she's in need of the money. And she ends up being sent to this mysterious house in the middle of nowhere called Hartwood Hall in order to teach a little boy called Louis Eversham, who lives there with his widowed mother. But once Margaret Lennox gets to Hartwood Hall, it soon becomes clear that there are things here she doesn't understand, secrets that she doesn't know about, and she's going to try and work out what isn't quite right about Hartwood Hall, I suppose.
There's so much twisty intrigue in this story. What kind of inspired it?
Mostly a lot of Victorian literature. I really love Victorian literature. I have been reading Victorian literature for a long time. I love it. So on BookTube, I run the readathon Victober, which is Victorian October, which happens every year, where we dedicate a month to reading Victorian literature, which lots of people take part in now, which is really fun. I've kind of always loved Victorian literature, and that's what a lot of the stuff I do on my BookTube channel is talking about Victorian literature. And because I've always loved that kind of period of literature, I've always been kind of interested in Victorian history as well. And so I guess The Secrets of Hartwood Hall kind of grew out of that. So you can probably tell from the description of the book that it has some serious Bronte vibes going on, like some Jane Eyre setup, I suppose. It takes some different turns, I hope, but I kind of wanted to write a book that was in conversation with Jane Eyre and The Tenant of Barford Hall and other Victorian books, I suppose, that had a lot of Victorian references in. And because I love Victorian literature, I wanted to write a book that looked at issues that were important during the Victorian period and kind of a story that was written in a Victorian style in many ways, but also told a story that wouldn't have been told in the Victorian period, or wouldn't have been allowed to be told in the Victorian period, I suppose. So I guess I wanted to look at the stuff that the Victorians were interested in, but also the stuff the Victorians didn't talk about. And The Secrets of Hartwood Hall kind of came out of that, I guess. Out of my interest in the Victorians, I suppose.
And you mentioned Jane Eyre. What's it like to have your book be compared to Jane Eyre when that's something that's been so inspirational for you?
Yeah, I mean, nice, but I think it's mostly because I have pinched some plot details and twisted them, which is kind of the point and kind of the fun of it. I think I really enjoyed playing with tropes from Victorian literature and tropes from Gothic literature in The Secrets of Hartwood Hall. So there's really heavy Jane Eyre references, not just in terms of the plot, but Margaret Lennox is a governess. She's teaching the little boy Louis literature, and they read Jane Eyre. There are bookshelves filled with different Victorian novels. There's a lot of very, very conscious nods to Jane Eyre. It's purposely quite heavily inspired and outright inspired, I suppose. So it's not the Jane Eyre, the Bronte vibes aren't subtle. So I feel that's, I think you would get the sense that Jane Eyre was an inspiration to the book if you knew anything about, even if you didn't know anything about Jane Eyre.
What was your research process like in getting all the historical details for this book?
So kind of probably the other way around from a lot of people in that, because as I say, I love Victorian literature, I also really like Victorian history. I feel like I've been doing research as a hobby in order, in preparation to write something set in the Victorian period, just most of my life. So I did, my degree at uni was joint honours, half English literature and half history. And I did a lot of Victorian literature and a lot of Victorian history at university and at school before that. And I also read lots and lots of Victorian literature, both from the Victorian period, fiction, non-fiction, and also history books about the Victorian period I really like as well. So I've kind of been doing low-key research for writing stuff set in the Victorian period for a really long time. So when I sat down to write The Secrets of Hartwood Hall, I didn't need to do much research before starting to write, because I had the Victorian world in my head well enough. So when I ended up doing the research, it was either for like small details as I went, or for things that I knew weren't developed enough on this like edit or on the editing process. So when I was going through like rounds of edits, there were a few specific things that I did like a lot of extra historical research for, because I knew I hadn't done enough, and I knew that they weren't as kind of deep as they should be. So one thing I did was look kind of more into, I sort of felt like I had a very good idea of what it meant to be a governess in the Victorian period, but I then went and read lots of conduct books from the 1840s and 50s that were written for governesses by other governesses, with like tips and advice, and this is how you should behave if you're a governess, which was really, really interesting. I also read a medical handbook from the 1840s that had been written by a doctor for other doctors with instructions on certain medical things, which was really, really interesting and really useful. And then I also did lots of like sort of setting historical research. So the book is set in like the West Country in England, in Somerset. And so I kind of wanted to do more research to make sure I was getting that right and that kind of bit of England right. So I like went and reread lots of Thomas Hardy, and like got books that were like specifically about the West Country and more of that bit of England. And I found a really great book online, which was about Victorian and Edwardian Somerset, and had lots of primary sources and old pictures in and things like that. So I did like, yeah, sort of top up research, I suppose, on my edits, rather than like doing lots of research before I began, I guess.
What is it about Victorian literature that you love so much?
Lots of things. I think it's partly a snowball effect, where because I've read a lot of it, I find it really interesting. Like if you have submerged yourself in a time period, then the more you know about it, the more interesting it is. So I think it is partly that. I think also the Victorians happened to write a lot of great books, which was partly because they happened to write a lot of great books, but also because of sort of specific historical things. So I think like the Victorian period is really like when the novel came to be what it is today. So the novel before the Victorian period, like people wrote novels, but they weren't mass media. They weren't like as popular as they became. And in the Victorian period, novels became hugely popular. They became the primary form of literature, and a lot of like modern genres that we love today kind of came out of the Victorian period, you know, like detective stories, science fiction, children's literature, horror, like lots of stuff that we love today came from the Victorians. Even like Victorian sensation fiction, which I love, is basically just like the precursors to modern thrillers. There's so much stuff you can see in Victorian literature which kind of came to be what novels are now. So I feel like you can see a lot of like the history of current literature in Victorian literature. I also just find Victorian history fascinating. Like it was a period of massive like social and economic and political and technological change, where society was just changing massively, and where they didn't really understand how technology was changing their society, and they were all a bit worried about it. And that's very, very interesting. And you see that a lot in their books and in the kind of things they wrote about. And I find that very like historically interesting to look back on that time period. I think also the Victorians, they're like, it's a bit far ago, like it's a long time ago, just not that long ago. So it's very different, which means it can be very interesting, especially if you're interested in history, but also doesn't feel that unfamiliar. Like the language of Victorian novels in general is pretty easy to follow. Not always, there'll always be references or words you might miss, but like in general, they're very readable, I find, especially if you don't get too bogged down in like making sure you know every cultural reference. And that means that actually they can be like really accessible and really fun, but also give you a window into a world that is slightly different, I guess.
And with these different issues that like kind of looking at the historical, you've described this as like Victorian feminism. Like how much fun was it to give these women a choice and like let them kind of explore their own path?
That's definitely something I wanted to do in The Secrets of Hartwood Hall. Obviously, like I think Jane Eyre is one of those interesting books where there's bits of Jane Eyre that aren't great in terms of like proto-feminism, but there's bits of it that are, and there's a sort of, it has its failings, but also there is like a demand for individualism and happiness and for women to be respected equal to men, which is there in bits of Jane Eyre. And I think the thing I find really interesting about Victorian literature as a whole is that Victorian literature actually does contain a lot of very proto-feminist texts, and there are a lot of texts which are really challenging the status quo and challenging kind of the Victorian ideas about gender roles and about women's place, I suppose. And the Victorians were kind of challenging that all the time, but also they couldn't always challenge it all the way, I suppose. So that's a kind of interesting thing, I think, when you're writing literature now set in the Victorian period, is that you can look at ideas that people would have had, but you can also push them further, or you can also explore a different angle. And I feel like the Jane Eyre vibes of The Secrets of Hartwood Hall are like really obvious, but actually The Tenant of Wildflower Hall was a huge inspiration too. And The Tenant of Wildflower Hall, I do think, is a really like proto-feminist Victorian novel, which looks a lot at like power dynamics in marriage and power imbalance in marriage in the Victorian period. And that was something else I wanted to talk about in The Secrets of Hartwood Hall. And I wanted to look at like, yeah, the lack of power some women had, but also women who didn't fit into sort of the expected social structure, I suppose. So governesses, like one of the reasons why Victorians wrote a lot of books about governesses, because governesses had like a weird class position where they were educated, but they were employed, and they were women who were earning their own money, but they were middle class. And the Victorians just didn't like that. It bothered them. So which means governesses are really interesting to write about in terms of proto-feminism or feminism, because they're already like not quite in the system. And the same with widows, because women in the Victorian period, you know, that the ideal was you were meant to be married, or you were meant to be looking for a husband because you weren't married yet. So if you're a widow and you had been married but you weren't anymore, that was a problem for the Victorians. So I kind of wanted to look at, different positions for women, I suppose, in the Victorian period, and how these different positions might enable them to break the rules.
Always a little fun to break the rules. There is quite the twist in this story. I did not see it coming. It was like, ooh. So did you know that was where you were heading? Did you have this plotted out, or this just kind of, or you were a pantser?
I am definitely a plotter. I did have the twist. The book changed a lot from the first draft to the last draft. Like the twist is the same, but I feel like a lot of the stuff around it has shifted and moved around and things like that. But yeah, I always had the twist in my head from the beginning. Yeah, I feel like I can't say more because of spoilers.
Exactly. Like, I want to talk about it, but I don't want to ruin it for everyone. What was the most fun part of this process for you?
Referencing lots of Victorian novels and messing with tropes, and the twist was fun to write. Like it's fun to put twists in books, I guess. That's a fun thing when writing, to try and like lead your reader in one direction and then take them in another, I suppose, is enjoyable. And I had a lot of fun with that. And
you're putting this book out in two different kind of versions, I guess you could call it, the UK version and the US, or editions. What was that process like of working on it for two different countries that are coming out around the same time?
I knew that it was going to be published in the UK maybe like a few weeks before I knew it was going to be published in the US. I think it was probably a few weeks between them. But it's being published so separately. So my UK publisher is Penguin Micro Joseph, and the US publisher is Dutton. So they both are part of Penguin Random House, but they are publishing it separately rather than like as one team. However, they have worked really closely together. So like all the editing was done together. So my two editors in the UK and my editor in the US worked together on all the edits, and we worked on it together, which was really nice. And to have all that like feedback together. But then the two covers are quite different, which is quite fun, because I feel like they both really sum up the book, but they also they look completely different. So they kind of give you different edges of the book, like different sides of the book, I suppose. And then it's coming out in the US. I'm not sure when this will go up, but it's coming out in the US on the 28th of February, and then coming out, which is a few days now away from when I'm filming this. And then it's coming out in the UK on the 30th of March. So it also feels a bit strange it's coming out in the US first, when obviously I'm in the UK. So that feels far away and not quite real. I think it'll feel more real when it's also out in the UK for me.
What are your feelings like going into launching your debut novel? Like, that's a big deal.
Yeah, it is a big deal. I feel like it doesn't really feel very real anymore. I also find it quite strange. So I've worked in publishing for lots of years. So I kind of know the process from the other side really well. I've been an editor. I'm freelance now, but I've worked for big UK publishers, not for the publisher who are publishing my book, which is kind of nice because it means I don't know the inside of that publisher, but I do know the inside of other publishers. And I have done the process as an editor from the other side. So I find it very, very surreal now going into my own publication, because on the one hand, it's a normal thing. I've worked in publishing, books get published all the time, but on the other hand, it's a much bigger deal and it's very different and it's very surreal and weird, I suppose. And I think also because the process takes a really long time. So I got my book deals in like nearly 2 years ago, just shy of 2 years ago. So it's been quite a long wait. And 2 years ago, 2 years felt like a very long time. And suddenly it's actually now here and the book is about to be published. And that's very strange. It's a very strange feeling, I guess.
So you work as an editor, you are writing a book, and you do a lot of booktube videos. How do you avoid burning out on words? Like I get this question a lot of people, like I work in a bookstore and I do all this stuff, like it's all this other wordy stuff. And people ask me a lot, like, how do you avoid getting burned out on words?
I just really like words, you know. I think it would take a lot to burn me out on words. Because I read a lot as well, and I love reading books, but I just really, really like books. And that has meant that lots of different things I do are related to books in different ways. But that just kind of feels natural. I don't know. There are some other things I like to spend my time doing, but mostly I like to spend my time on books. So I kind of don't mind that. Sometimes it's a juggle of balancing time, but yeah, I just really enjoy books, I suppose, which is why I like to edit them and to read them and to write them and to talk about them on the internet.
What was the kind of the best piece of advice you've gotten along on this process?
Ages ago, I did a creative writing master's a really long time ago. Well, many years ago, before I had the idea for Hartwood Hall, when I was working on different stuff. And one of the tutors on that MA said something like, when you're writing, there are no rules. You can do anything as long as you do it well, which I found really funny because I think that is kind of true. I feel like there's a lot of advice and you should probably follow the advice. But you don't have to follow the advice. You just have to pull it off if you don't follow the advice in terms of like how you write and the way you write and following rules of plotting and all of that kind of stuff. It can be helpful to do that, but also sometimes you don't have to, as long as you find a way to make it work. But I think like probably the best advice I would give, which is not necessarily advice I have got, is to join a writing group, like for people who like to write, because I have found like my own writing group hugely helpful. And I think that like it's really good to write lots and it's really good to read lots, but I feel like you don't really get better at writing unless you think really hard about specifically how to get better at writing, and actually joining a writing group and having other people read your work, reading other people's work, like really massively helps with that. And as well as it gives you a community of like writers to talk about. So I feel like that's probably the best advice.
You've been sharing this journey with your YouTube followers. What has that community been like in their support and just kind of feedback for you so far?
Really, really lovely, actually. Yeah, really nice. Everyone has been very excited, which is good. And I put up a video a couple of weeks ago, which was like me reading aloud the first chapter, and people really liked it, which was really good because I was a bit anxious that people might not. But everyone who commented said they really enjoyed it. I'm sure there's some people who didn't enjoy it and didn't comment, and that's fine. I'm perfectly happy if people don't like my book, but I'd rather they didn't tell me. But yeah, that's really nice and encouraging, because I think it's difficult because books are so subjective, and I know that, and especially on BookTube, like I know from reading books that I know other people love that I just haven't gotten on with, or I've hosted read-alongs before of books that I think are like the best thing ever, and you know, half the people who are doing the read-along love it and half the people who are doing the read-along don't get on with it at all. You know, books are so subjective, so I know that not everyone who enjoys my videos is going to enjoy my book, and that's fine. But I think a lot of people who enjoy my videos will, especially because I talk a lot about classics and historical fiction on my BookTube channel, which is like, I mean, the book is just full of Victorian literature stuff. So hopefully people will like that. But yeah, it's been really exciting to share it with people on BookTube and for people to be excited. That's definitely been really lovely. There's been like a few reviews gone up already from booktubers who've got review copies, which has been really, really, really nice when they've enjoyed it. Yeah, it means a lot.
You've been doing BookTube for like 8 years now, or almost 8 years, right?
I think it must be. I think it'll be 8 years in June. Yeah, long time.
So we're seeing a lot more people joining BookTube, Bookstagram, Book Talk, as kind of books had this resurgence during the COVID years. What would your advice be to someone who's just getting started in the BookTube space?
Talk about the books that you want to talk about and that you like to read, rather than like the books that everyone else is talking about. You can, if you want to read those books and talk about them, that's absolutely fine. But also if you just want to talk about whatever you want to talk about, then that's also great. I feel like when I started on BookTube, there were not many people talking about classics, and now there are a lot of people talking about classics, and that's really nice. And you know, sometimes communities grow because people start talking about books that other people aren't talking about. And I think sometimes there's a sort of pressure to, well, you feel that you should be reading the books that everyone else is reading, but you really don't have to. And I guess the other thing that is important is to like find the community and like befriend other people. And I think it's a really good thing to do if you're just starting on BookTube, or I guess probably BookTok or Bookstagram too, to like find other people who are starting at a similar time, because they're also going to be looking for a community, and they're also going to be looking for people to buddy read with and to join in things with and to communicate with. And so that's kind of, it's nice to go on that journey together. And like, you know, I still have BookTube friends who I've been like chatting to on BookTube for years, and that's really nice, and that makes a difference. And actually, yeah, connecting with people through BookTube kind of individually, doing buddy reads, joining in read-alongs and readathons and all that kind of stuff, and like really taking part in the community, watching other people's videos, commenting on other people's videos so they know that you've watched their video. That kind of stuff makes a massive difference and makes you feel like much more invested in the community, I think. Because
this is Literary Hype, what books are you hyped about right now?
I have my TBR shelf is right here, just off camera. There's a lot of books that I'm very excited for. There's a book I got recently I'm really looking forward to reading, which is called The New Life by Tom Crew, which is late Victorian period set about two people who are in married couples, and one of them, he is married to a woman, but he's fallen in love with a man, and the other one is married to a woman who's fallen in love with another woman, and these two men end up coming together to write a book about like how to change society to make it a better place. Sounds very, very up my street and really, really interesting. Set Victorian period, which is my favorite thing. So I'm really excited for that. That's quite a new release. Other books in the Victorian period, I've also got Theatre of Marvels on my TBR pile, which came out last year, which is again set in the Victorian period at a theatre. And that sounds really, really good. But in general, I just have, a lot of books sat on my shelves waiting to be read. And there's so many other exciting books coming out later this year that I'm really looking forward to. Lots of like great historical fiction coming out. And just, there's always a lot of new releases. Always so many books to read.
There's so many books to read, so little time. But thank you so much for hanging out with me, talking about your book. I'm very excited to see it on store shelves very soon.
Thank you very much.
Have a lovely day. Thanks to Katie for hanging out and talking about her book, The Secrets of Hartwood Hall. If you're interested in grabbing a copy, there are links to buy it down below, as well as links to find her channel and her on social media as well. And while you're down there, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, all the good things that you know helps grow this channel, helps grow the community. Until next time, thanks for watching.